Hello readers by eyes and by ears, this is Mari Chen and welcome back to my channel. I hope you all had an excellent weekend and are all caught up with Yu Volume 2 because as of the last video, we are officially in Remnants of Filth Volume 3 and I'm super duper excited to go ahead and get into these next chapters because of where we left off on chapter 69. So without further ado, let us just go ahead and get right into this story, shall we? Enjoy! Chapter 70. Guilt is heavy work. Morsi blinked. I don't need anything, he said slowly. If you don't like the steamed buns, there's meat too, Goo Mahng replied. I'll split that with you too. Morsi turned his face to hide his stinging eyes. I just ate. All of this is for you. Only then did Goo Mahng resume his chewing, appeased. After he finished, the two descended the mountain together. The path was steep and long. Goo Mahng didn't like to rely on others, so he stumbled and limped in front, while Morsi followed, wordlessly watching his figure from behind. The view was so familiar. Many years ago, there had been a young general who doggedly led his brothers over hill and dale, blazing a trail through the thorny wilderness. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, and he had no time to fuss over his appearance, so he was often grimy and sometimes hunched and ragged. He was like a mayfly trying to topple a tree, whom anyone could crush with their pinky. But this mayfly would always struggle back up after being struck, tenacious and indefatigable. He would never be defeated. He had once been the army's invincible god of war. He had given countless people faith that they would be victorious and hope that they would return home safely. Morsi had thought it was for this reason that he yearned to see Goo Mahng repent and apologize for his wrongdoings. But when he saw Goo Mahng kneeling before each grave in that forest of tombs, kowtowing to the heavens for his crimes, Morsi's pain only deepened. The sight of Goo Mahng with his spine bent, his spirit broken, this wasn't pleasing at all. Very few enjoyed seeing the strong made fragile, let alone a person who had been your guiding light. As Morsi's thoughts wandered, Goo Mahng stopped and turned to look at him. What is it? Goo Mahng pointed at the three-way fork in the road. I don't remember which way to go. Is it left? Morsi glanced to the left, where the trees had fallen and left a patch of bare ground. The path was blocked off with military-issue chains. The two elite guards from the imperial palace kept watch. A barrier shone behind them, obscuring everything beyond from view. That's the forbidden area of Warrior Soul Mountain. No one is allowed in, said Morsi. Go to the right. Goo Mahng looked thoughtfully toward that mysterious restricted area, his eyes slowly growing unfocused. An expression of sorrow washed over his face, as though he had remembered something. What's the matter? Morsi asked. It was precisely sunset. Before Goo Mahng could answer, the bleak peal of bells rose from behind the distant city walls, echoing between the heavens and the earth. The wind picked up in the mountain forest, gusting from the depths of the forbidden area and over the meandering mountain path. Leaves rustled on the trees, and birds flitted to and fro. In the cool breeze, Goo Mahng slowly closed his eyes. I don't know, he said, but I think I've dreamed of this place before. This strange offhand comment could not be true. When the emperor sealed this area, Goo Mahng had already defected. He couldn't possibly have been there before. No one can go in there, Morsi said. There are guards keeping watch at all hours. How could you have come here? Goo Mahng's lips parted, but he didn't know what to say. He could only hum in agreement and walk away, even as he cast longing looks over his shoulder. Many days of kneeling had left Goo Mahng exhausted and half-starved. When they returned to the manor, Goo Mahng ate and bathed, then burrowed into his den to drop off to sleep. He made no more mention of the restricted area. Goo Mahng slept soundly all night and well into the next day. When he woke at last, He saw Morsi standing in Osmanthus Hall in black and gold robes, his hands behind his back. Upon hearing movement behind him, Morsi turned around and tossed Goo Mahng a scroll. Catch. What's this? Introduction to Magic and History of Chonghua combined, replied Morsi. Yesterday, I spoke to His Imperial Majesty about your desire to turn over a new leaf. He told me to give you these books. Goo Mahng had been noisily flipping through the scroll. At this, he looked up, eyes shining. He agreed to let me start over? Morsi shot him a strange look before responding. Let me remind you, I've warned you already that there's no chance His Imperial Majesty will retract your execution order, regardless of what you do to make amends. You cannot change the final outcome, no matter what. The flowers in the courtyard cast gentle shadows within the hall, but these words were cruel. Morsi said, You will still be used for black magic experiments, and once you lose your value, you will die. He paused. Do you understand? I do. Morsi closed his eyes. Think it over carefully, and make your mind before you answer. I've knelt for 4 days. My mind is already made up. Goo Mahn's bearing was serene, so much so that it reminded Morsi of the man from days past, the one who could hold the sky aloft on his shoulders if ever it should fall. I know His Imperial Majesty only wants me to learn what's in these books so he can continue to use me. Instead of getting a free lunch, it's better if I work for my food. I understand. Not only that, Morsi said. The reason he wants me to teach you these subjects is because he holds out hope that you will remember something useful. What's wrong with that? Goo Mahng asked. I want to know what happened to me in the past. I want to know whether what you all say is true. Morsi's hands clenched into fists, nails sinking deep into the flesh of his palm. I've explained everything. If you choose this path, don't blame Chonghua for its ruthlessness on the day of your execution. You'd better not be bitter about it. Of course I'll be bitter, but you'll die someday, and so will I. Goo Mahng caressed the bamboo scroll as if laying a hand on his own future. His thought process was almost bestial in its simplicity. But if I can do better for some little while before then, I might as well. He looked up, limpid eyes staring squarely at Morsi. Otherwise, why shouldn't I just die tomorrow? It would be better than spending my days in pain. Morsi found himself at a loss for words. It seemed he always arrived here, whether he was talking to the shameless General Goo or this thoughtless Goo Mahng. He silently stared at Goo Mahng for a while. From now on, come to my study every day after sunset, at the hour of Shee. I will do my best to teach you. Hugging the scrolls to his chest, Goo Mahng nodded. Thus, Morsi began to teach Goo Mahng a few beginner's spells that didn't require much spiritual energy, as well as pieces of Chonghua's history. Goo Mahng had used to know all these things. According to Jiang Fu Li, learning them a second time might help Goo Mahng recall the memories he was missing. And indeed, it turned out to be quite an effective method. Day after day passed like this, and the end of spring arrived before they knew it. Goo Mahng recalled memory after memory from the past, but perhaps Jiang Fu Li's calming medicine was too potent. All he regained were light and unimportant fragments. Most were related to his studies at the Cultivation Academy. These memories weren't very useful. Perhaps their greatest utility was in letting Goo Mahng recover a shadow of his old self, such that he was no longer quite so brainless. Sometimes he swaggered about like General Goo, but other times he crouched silently in a corner like a wolf. At some times, his speech was clever and sparkling with wit, but at others, he stumbled over every word, halting and incoherent. Much to Morsi's vexation, as fragments of Goo Mahng's memories returned, he began to inadvertently repeat things he used to say. For example, he would often speak with an absurdly arrogant cant and nearly get his knees broken by Li Wei. Or he'd call Morsi Morshidi and nearly get his legs broken by Morsi. Goo Mahng had yet to find a balance between his instincts and the rules. He often found himself in situations where he'd have to swallow the latter half of a sentence after starting it. Once, for example, he thought to help Li Wei sweep the courtyard. With a sudden flash of inspiration, he waved his hands and pushed up his sleeves as he strode up to Li Wei and called out, "Come here, let me—" Before he could finish his statement, he met Housekeeper Li's quizzical look and was quickly startled out of General Goo's shadow. He shook his head and carefully stuttered, "Sweeping, help you." As time went on, Goo Mahng found he hardly knew how to speak anymore. He often stood in the courtyard with his mouth open, vacantly staring into space. When others called for him unexpectedly, the expression on his face seemed caught between Goo Mahng and General Goo, flickering back and forth. He had no idea how he was supposed to act, or what to say to avoid annoying those around him. So when confronted by others, he was wont to simply purse his lips, reduced to long spells of plaintive silence. Housekeeper Li was compelled to pronounce candidly, "If you ignore the fact he's a felon, that look of his is pretty cute and pitiful." Morsi's sole response was a cold snort. Nevertheless, whenever he wasn't at court and didn't have other matters on his plate, Morsi stayed in the manor and taught Goo Mahng to read. As in his youth, Goo Mahng liked to scribble in cursive, but disliked writing in formal script. He liked Introduction to Magic, but disliked History of Chonghua. On one particular day, however, Morsi returned to the manor to find Goo Mahng sitting by the Tai Hu stones near the pond's rippling waters. He was eating an apple and engrossed in reading History of Chonghua. The sight was so unexpected that Morsi couldn't help but walk up behind Goo Mahng and lean in to see what he was poring over. "What is it? Is this part particularly interesting?" His voice was low, slow, and deeply charismatic, and his lips were a hair's breadth from Goo Mahng's ear. The heat of his breath made Goo Mahng jump and whip around to stare, a piece of apple still held between glossy teeth. The two were so close Goo Mahng's lips nearly brushed Morsi's cheek. Although Goo Mahng hardly noticed, Morsi's ears instinctively reddened, and he abruptly straightened up. At length, he said stiffly, "Don't turn around so quickly in the future." Goo Mahng swallowed his bite of apple with an audible gulp and licked his lips. "You're the one who snuck up behind me and spoke in my ear. How is it my fault?" Morsi had no retort. The wolf-like and witless Goo Mahng from several months ago would never have said anything of the kind, but his expression right now held some of the former Gu Shixiong's unreasonable manner. Still, Morsi knew that he was the one being unreasonable in the situation. "Any more backtalk, and you'll be coming to study tonight to copy Legends of Divine Catastrophe." Goo Mahng opened his mouth. The haughty spirit of the war god Goo Mahng itched to make a snappy comeback, but in the end, the shell of the traitor Goo Mahng deflated. Pliant obedience once more filled those blue eyes. Morsi couldn't tell which state displeased him more, and he had no desire to continue this frustrating comparison. He lifted his chin and prodded the bamboo scroll in Goo Mahng's hand. "Why are you still on this part?" "Oh." Virtue, mind, and wisdom were the titles of the three gentlemen of Chonghua. This particular chapter told of the best of them, wisdom. In the past century, the titles of virtue and mind had been passed down to younger generations. Wisdom alone had found no worthy successor. Goo Mahng pointed at the small painting of the wise gentleman. "This person looks familiar." Chapter 71. Tang and Poe-ahn. Morsi was silent for a moment. He crossed his arms and stretched his long legs to lean against the pillar behind Goo Mahng. "You think the wise gentleman looks familiar?" I think I've seen him before, but I forgot who he was." Morsi arched one sharp brow. "The wise gentleman died hundreds of years ago. Perhaps you've gotten him mixed up with someone else." Goo Mahng didn't appear to accept that explanation. He stared at the painting for several more seconds and then proclaimed resolutely, "I've definitely seen someone who looks like him. Do you think he could have ascended and become immortal, so he wouldn't have died?" "That's impossible." "Why?" The wise gentleman died of a shattered core in the battle that consecrated his name in history. Chonghua has never again named anyone wisdom in honor of his memory. Having personally experienced the pain of a shattered core, Goo Mahng flinched involuntarily. Why was his core destroyed? Did he do something wrong? The wise gentleman was always pure and beyond reproach, but if you were to say he did something wrong, it was probably in making an exception to shelter an academy disciple. Moshi paused. He trusted the wrong person. Why is everyone doing this? The painted subject gazed out from the silk scroll, his expression serene. His eyes seemed to contain compassion as well as gentleness. Trusted the wrong person, Goo Mahng murmured. He hesitated. But it's not written in the book. History of Chonghua is an abridged history. It doesn't contain the biographies of every notable person. It only lists the spells they created and their achievements. Of course you won't find every detail here. Will you tell me about it then? Goo Mahng turned around and propped his long legs on the bench, gazing at Morsi in anticipation. Morsi paused. Sit properly, not like a ruffian. Goo Mahng reluctantly set his feet back on the ground. Happily, Morsi had nothing else to attend to. After a moment spent recalling this particular history, he began to tell Goo Mahng of the past. The wise gentleman was named Tang. He was once the headmaster of the Cultivation Academy as well as state preceptor. Under his leadership, the academy produced countless talented commanders and grandmasters and devised many new spells and techniques. There was a saying back then that, with Preceptor Tang's guidance, even the least talented disciple could transform themselves and achieve success. Thus, people named him the Wise Gentleman with the Golden Touch. Then wouldn't everyone be begging him to teach them? Goo Mahng asked. There was no need to beg. Tang taught everyone regardless of background. As the headmaster of the academy, he paid personal attention to every single disciple. Morsi paused. Even the academy slaves. Back then, there was a young slave at the Cultivation Academy who refused to resign himself to a lifetime of inferiority. He wished to wield the same power as cultivators, so each time Tang gave a lecture, he would pretend to be cleaning the seats very slowly in order to eavesdrop next to the platform. Ah, how daring. Wouldn't he get shooed away? Other elders might have done so, but Tang didn't, said Morsi. That slave knew the headmaster's benevolence and picked his lectures for that very reason. What's more, he was very intelligent. He memorized nearly everything Preceptor Tang imparted to his disciples. Goo Mahng raised his hand. I got it. And then this little slave secretly cultivated and became terrifically powerful, and then fought Princess Haitang. Morsi blinked, his habitually grave expression giving way to rare confusion. Who? That amazing princess, like Mengzi, Princess Haitang. It's Preceptor Tang, not Haitang. Preceptor as in head master of the academy. It's a different thing from Princess Mengzi. Fine, Goo Mahng answered, but it sounds the same to me. Princess Tang, then. Morsi pursed his lips slightly. Gu Shuxiong had always liked to tease Morsi by calling him princess. It turned out this rascal's habit of calling men princess hadn't changed even now. Morsi kneaded his temple with slender fingers, as if afflicted with a sudden headache. He didn't want to discuss semantics of preceptor or princess. So, after taking a few breaths, he continued. You guessed the first part right. That slave indeed cultivated in secret, but things weren't so neat. Developing a spiritual core is a dangerous process. The stronger a cultivator's innate ability, the more torment they must endure. That slave had no idea he possessed astonishing potential, to the extent that he lost control and went berserk as soon as he started developing his core. The academy dorms burst into flames, and the secret of his cultivation was exposed. He was brought before Preceptor Tang. Goo Mahng was entranced. As soon as Morsi stopped to take a breath, he blurted out, Then what happened? Did Princess Tang break the slave's spiritual core? No. The slave's core hadn't fully formed. It was still in the process of coalescing, and he was in a great deal of pain. Tang knew that if no one reached out to guide him, he would combust and die. So because of his great compassion, he defied the law that forbade slaves from cultivating and helped the young man through his trial. The plants in the courtyard swayed. Morsi gazed at the glimmering ripples of the water and continued. After Tang helped him, the slave knelt and thanked him profusely. He would do anything to repay this gift of life. Seeing that the slave had a strong spiritual foundation, Tang's heart softened. He reported the incident to the emperor and took the young man as an academy disciple. Goo Mahng sighed. That slave was so lucky. In any case, what was his name? He had no parents to give him one. The academy overseers usually called him 13, his slave registry number. But after Tang took him in, he gave him a new name. Morsi hesitated for a moment. Poe-ahn. Tang. Poe-ahn. As if spooked by the sound, several birds in the surrounding trees startled into flight, clearing the high walls and soaring into the sky. Morsi shot a glance at Goo Mahng. He was in an interesting situation. While Poe-ahn's infamy was such that his name was almost an unspeakable taboo and uttering it akin to a curse. Even now, many in Chonghua wouldn't dare mention him in casual conversation. But Goo Mahng didn't react at all to this monster's name, as if it was that of an ordinary person. He merely asked, was Poe-ahn the person Princess Tang shouldn't have trusted? Correct. Tang's faith in him was misplaced. He had no idea what kind of evil he'd taken in and was completely oblivious to the fact that he had personally bestowed a name on a monster who would bring disaster to the 9 provinces for nearly a century. He thought things would carry on as usual, and that he'd only perform a truly insignificant action. Morsi lowered his head and gazed at the painting of Tang, saturated with sunlight. The brushstrokes lent him a gentle and warm appearance, as if the subject were gazing through time to meet the viewer's eye. Years went by. Tang's care wasn't wasted on Poe-ahn. He grew stronger and more powerful. He accomplished many remarkable feats for Chonghua and received the emperor's regard and commendation. The emperor even tried to end the ban on slave cultivating in hopes of finding more incredible talents like him. Goo Mahng was amazed. So Chonghua had thought of putting slaves to use en masse even back then? He couldn't help but ask, did he succeed? No. Abolishing the prohibition was no trivial matter. The emperor first specially allowed Poe-ahn to select some clever slaves from among the people and instruct them in cultivation. Goo Mahng seemed somewhat disappointed, but he said, that's all right too. At least they had an opportunity to prove themselves. Prove themselves? Morsi scoffed, as though he'd heard a great joke. Yes, they proved themselves, but what they proved wasn't impressive spiritual power, but rather ravenous ambition. As he spoke, he met Goo Mahn's blue eyes, clear as river water. Goo Mahng, do you know why Chonghua's nobles are so skittish about allowing slaves to cultivate? Goo Mahng shook his head. Because of Poe-ahn. The emperor gave him the power to raise an army, but in the end, he turned this knife against the heart of Chonghua. Morsi's face was grim. The cultivators Poe-ahn taught didn't seek to repay the country's kindness. Rather, they wanted to overturn established order and throw Chonghua into chaos. Poe-ahn defected. Goo Mahng fell silent as a realization slowly dawned. Then, the army I had was very similar to Poe-ahn's, wasn't it? Yes. Morsi also paused for a beat before slowly continuing. Many people saw Poe-ahn in you. Back when Poe-ahn made his move, Preceptor Tang was there to stop him. But if you were to repeat his crime, a similar disaster would undoubtedly befall Chonghua, and if it did, no one knew who could stop it. Goo Mahng paled slightly, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the scroll. Are we alike? He asked quietly. Poe-ahn and I. Noting Goo Mahng's unease, Morsi softened his tone. You aren't the same. It's true that you also committed treason, but Poe-ahn was a madman beyond imagination. In order to strengthen his slave cultivators as quickly as possible, he kidnapped many butterfly-boned beauty feasts for military use. What are butterfly-boned beauty feasts? They are people with a special constitution. Morsi's tone held disgust. He was unwilling to say much on the subject. They can be used as dual cultivation vessels, or eaten directly, he said simply. Even the most ordinary cultivator can improve their cultivation instantaneously by consuming the flesh of such people. Poe-ahn used this cruel method of cannibalism to pull up a group of slaves sworn to him with their lives. He left to establish his own country on Chonghua's northern frontier and proclaimed himself king. As he spoke, Morsi closed the scroll of History of Chonghua on Goo Mahn's knees. Now that I've said all this, he said, lowering his head, let me ask you, do you know which country Poe-ahn was the founding monarch of? Oh, God. Oh, God. Goo Mahng looked at him blankly. Liao, he stuttered. Correct. Morsi's expression became graver. The Liao Kingdom's founding monarch, Poe-ahn. He was the ruinous consequence of the first time Chonghua trusted a slave. Morsi had only meant to tell Goo Mahng something of the Liao Kingdom and Chonghua's history. He hadn't meant to insinuate anything about Goo Mahng. Nevertheless, his words were taken with intent. Goo Mahng was overcome with embarrassment and shame. He felt as though a hand had tightened around his throat, rendering him momentarily unable to speak. As he had regained some sense of his past self in recent days, he felt ever more strongly that his actions from before he lost his memories had been incomprehensible. Even if Chonghua had its flaws, at least it was a nation that had once tried to change for the better, only to end up the victim of other schemes. Chonghua had believed in Poe-ahn, but Poe-ahn turned and dealt a blow to the nobles led by Tang. If Goo Mahng were in their shoes, could he ever reservedly trust a slave-born person again? Who knew if that person might become the next Poe-ahn, or whether they would found the next black magic Liao Kingdom? Yet, under these conditions, Chonghua had still given its slaves a second chance. Whether to achieve a balance of power, or to exploit them, or for other reasons, Chonghua once again gave power to a slave, to Goo Mahng and his army. How much determination and courage might it have taken the former emperor to make such a decision? In the end, Goo Mahng had become an exemplary Poe-ahn. He might not have led his army in an uprising, but he still defected and fled to the very Liao Kingdom that Poe-ahn founded. He'd walked a path far too similar to that of his predecessor. After a long, conflicted silence, Goo Mahng slowly set down the bamboo scroll. I'm sorry. The most worthless phrase in the world. One Goo Mahng had already repeated thousands of times in front of those heroes' gravestones. It took Morsi a moment to understand what Goo Mahng meant. He didn't know how to respond. He heard Goo Mahng speak up again. What about Princess Tang? In the end, how was his core destroyed? Chapter 72. Yesteryear Defeat. It was because of Poe-ahn. What did Poe-ahn do? Asked Goo Mahng. After founding the Liao Kingdom, he delved into the ancient writings of the demon race and used other unorthodox methods to hatch a demon blood beast of devastating power. A demon blood beast? Indeed, Morsi said. This demon blood beast possessed terrifying abilities. Once it grew immatured, it threatened to swallow the entire population of Chonghua in a matter of days. Goo Mahn's blue eyes widened. Then what did they do? It happened too quickly. The nation's forces were helpless in the face of it. Morsi paused briefly. The only person in Chonghua who understood Poe-ahn's spiritual techniques was Tang. He felt every kind of regret and shame at having taught Poe-ahn magic and believed it was his failure of judgment that had led Chonghua to his calamity. Thus, in the final battle with Poe-ahn, he chose to die with the demon, using his own spiritual core and souls to seal and slay the demon blood beast. Goo Mahng was caught in the words as if in a trance. In his mind's eye, He could almost see Preceptor Chun colliding with the demon blood beast's spiritual power, their spells arcing and exploding across the battlefield. Tang met his end with a destroyed core and a consumed corpse, Morsi said. Forget ascending as an immortal. His souls and those of the demon beasts perished together. Reincarnation isn't even a possibility. There's no way you could have seen the wise gentleman. Morsi met Goo Mahn's azure gaze. You probably met someone who looked like him. Goo Mahng lowered his head, but he hesitated for a long while, but no words came. After a long beat, he could only concede haltingly. Probably, then. In the days after he heard this story, Goo Mahng became somewhat absent-minded. His dreams were full of scattered reflections. Sometimes they were things he'd dreamed about before. Sometimes the scenes were completely new. Sometimes he even dreamed of Preceptor Tang from the story. Clad in snow-white robes, the man from the painting stood amid flower petals raining from the sky. Goo Mahng couldn't quite make out the man's face, but he was vaguely aware that this was indeed Tang. Yet when he tried to step closer to see his features more clearly, the falling haitang blossoms turned into a great deluge of blood. Tang's voice was dark, filled with resentment, disappointment, heartbreak, hatred. "Traitor," he said. "How could you be worthy?" Traitor. "When did Chonghua ever do you wrong? When did I ever do you wrong?" Every word seemed to weep blood. Traitor. Traitor. Goo Mahng stared blankly. He didn't know why he would dream of Tang or why Tang would speak to him thus. Still, he thought, why had he committed treason? He writhed in misery, his thoughts a roil. Under Tang's questioning, his dream self knelt, clutching his head. Why had he committed treason? The vision shattered. Tang and the bloody rain dispersed. Goo Mahng slowly raised his head to find he was kneeling in the throne room, covered in filth and weeping in sorrow. Up on the throne, the emperor's expression was one of apathy. Within the hall, ridicule was written on the officials' faces. Goo Mahng resembled a soul boiling in the bloody pits of Asura hell, ceaselessly slamming his forehead against the ground as he kowtowed. "Please, just let us build gravestones. Please, I'm begging. There are too many dead. There are really too many dead." "Your Imperial Majesty, Marquis, I beg of you." This nightmare plagued him for days. On the evening of the 4th, the situation became dire. Even dinner couldn't lift Goo Mahng's spirits. He sat on his little stool, chewing on his chopsticks as he stared into space. Since Princess Meng's visit, Goo Mahng had stopped sitting in the seat across from Morsi. Li Wei would bring a small stool for a seat and bench for a table, and Goo Mahng would hunch over to eat there. Each day, Morsi directed the servants to send Goo Mahng food from his table, using excuses like, "This food doesn't taste good, I don't want it," or "It's too much, I can't finish it." Goo Mahng would happily take the offending morsel off Morsi's hands. Today was no different. Morsi picked at his food before pointing at the roast goose on the table, the sweet and sour crispy meats, and steamed perch. "Give these to him," he said to Li Wei, clearly referring to Goo Mahng, who was sitting at his little bench. Goo Mahng had been well behaved recently. He had long ago learned to say thank you after receiving each dish, but today, Goo Mahng didn't say anything. He stared with empty eyes at the servants placing the sumptuous dishes before him, not even the ghost of happiness appearing on his face. Morsi dismissed the servants and took a couple mouthfuls of hot soup. "Your eyes used to light up at the mere sight of pork bun. Now, you have all sorts of meat before you, but you don't speak a word of praise." Goo Mahng turned his head, hands clasped around a meat pie. "I'm thinking." "What are you thinking about?" Goo Mahng lowered his head. "I've been thinking all day about why I would defect," he said in a muffled voice. Morsi was still for a moment. I've told you before, Lu Jianxing was the fuse, and your ambition was the gunpowder. His Imperial Majesty stripped you of authority, but you refused to bend a knee. But, Goo Mahng said softly, but I remember, it seems like many people died. Startled, Shee looked up, a chill in his expression. I only remember a little, said Goo Mahng. I remember kneeling in the Great Hall. I kept kowtowing, begging you all for leniency, but no one listened to me, he murmured. Shee was silent for a long while. A question issued from his mouth, deep and low, burdened with accumulated suffering. When did you remember this? Just yesterday, Goo Mahng answered. Is something wrong? Shee's heart pounded, his eyes flashing with complicated feeling. He hadn't expected that Goo Mahng would recover this scrap of memory. Even if Goo Mahng didn't understand the context of that scene, this information would be enough to shock all of Chonghua. It was this dispute in the throne room that had led Goo Mahng to lose faith, and it was difficult to judge who had been in the right. If Goo Mahng recovered this memory alone from among his destroyed recollections, would he be prone to develop hatred and the desire for vengeance against the nobles of Chonghua? Shee? After a moment's silence, Shee decided to speak frankly. Firstly, he disliked lying. Secondly, telling Goo Mahng everything from the start might at least prepare him for the truth. Listen, Goo Mahng, this matter is not as simple as you think. No matter what memories you recover related to this, you must come to me for an explanation first. Don't try to guess anything on your own. Goo Mahng nodded. After a while, he raised his hand. Then I have something I want to ask right now. Go ahead. When I was kneeling in the Great Hall, was I begging for mercy for Lu Jianxing? Not entirely, Shee replied. Shee hadn't personally witnessed this confrontation at court. When Goo Mahng returned to the capital to make his report, Shee had still been on the battlefields at the western frontier, unable to extricate himself. He had only learned what happened later from watching the Imperial Scribe's history mirror. All he knew was that Lu Jianxing, Goo Mahng, and Mu Zhonglian had led the army to Phoenix Cry Mountain, where Goo Mahng had split off from the others. Goo Mahng had gone directly to the hinterlands of the Liao Kingdom's southernmost city, while Lu Jianxing and Mu Zhonglian kept watch over the troops. It should have been a flawless plan, if not for Lu Jianxing's quick temper. An envoy from a neutral country started an argument with him. In the heat of the moment, Lu Jianxing beheaded the envoy. This third country immediately sided with the Liao Kingdom as a result and attacked Chonghua's encampment from behind Phoenix Cry Mountain. Disaster befell Chonghua's armies. At the time, Goo Mahng had been personally leading his troops on the front lines. They had planned to infiltrate enemy ranks and splinter the Liao Kingdom's power from within. However, this effort was unsustainable for long. By the third day, Mu Zhonglian's imperial army was meant to rush over to reinforce their numbers. Then, coordinating the offensive from within and without the enemy forces, they would be poised to break through in one blow. But thanks to Lu Jianxing's rash action, Mu Zhonglian's troops were diverted into fighting the third country and couldn't provide assistance. Goo Mahng bitterly waited for reinforcements that never came, and their original plan of attack became a fatal dead end. When the besieged Goo Mahng learned that the third nation had allied with the Liao Kingdom because Lu Jianxing killed their envoy, he burst out cursing in indignation and sorrow. Lu Jianxing, are you fucking trying to kill me? Why the fuck are you so stupid? How selfish can you be? How selfish can you be? But what use were his complaints? 100,000 soldiers had put their lives on the line with Goo Mahng. They'd come from nothing to reach the heights of fathomless glory at his side, but overnight they were annihilated. How many of them would return in one piece? At that time, Goo Mahng could think of nothing else. When he was done cursing, he wiped his tears and clenched his teeth, setting his shattered heart on fire to light the way home for those 100,000 brothers. He counted each and every one, every man he kept alive, every man he brought back to their homeland. In so many battles, Goo Mahng had fought for victory. This time, he fought to go home. Later, he realized that the one at fault in this campaign hadn't been Lu Jianxing. It had been him. He was well aware of Lu Jianxing's fiery temper, but he'd still believed this brother of his could handle such a weighty responsibility. It was Goo Mahng who had made an outrageous mistake, who had erred beyond belief. Goo Mahng had no intention of absolving himself of responsibility. He had been prepared to make penance with his own death, but he couldn't let his 100,000 comrades be tarred with the same brush. The mistake had been his. All who had lost their lives and shed their blood, they were innocent. They deserved respect. They shouldn't be erased. He was willing to sacrifice all he had achieved so those brothers who died in vain could receive a gravestone with their names on it. It was he who led them to their deaths. Whenever he closed his eyes, he recalled those humble names, those dirty, smiling faces, their eyes shining with boundless trust. Some of the cultivators were so young, barely 15 years old, dressed in shabby clothes, their voices full of reverence and hope when they called him General Goo. General Goo! General Goo! Each cry echoed. Each word was stained with blood. Was he worthy? He wasn't. The General Goo they admired was a useless, good-for-nothing who cared only for the code of brotherhood. He'd led them to die inglorious deaths on the battlefield. He simply couldn't let them go to their graves without even a name. So he begged. He knelt at the foot of the throne, covered in blood and filth, mud streaking his face. And he begged. Please, give them a name. I'll take all the blame myself. Give them a gravestone. An army's defeat is the fault of the commander. The soldiers are blameless. Please, I'm begging you. But his imperial majesty refused, and the hall full of onlookers sneered at his grief. He was like the lowly hegemon king who had finally reached the battlefields of Xia on the eve of his defeat. What did his enemy, Liu Bang, care if he was alone and doomed? Footnote number 1. Xiang Yu, the hegemon king of Western Chu, was a prominent warlord who fought Liu Bang, eventual founding emperor of Han Dynasty, and was defeated at the Battle of Xia. He committed suicide in disgrace. Returning to the reading, and I'll reread that. What did his enemy, Liu Bang, care if he was alone and doomed? They wanted nothing more than to hand him that fatal sword. Their eyes flashed red, and they longed to see him bare his neck for the blade. Only when he was dead would they be at ease. Only then could they be sure that there wouldn't be another slave in this century who would upend the heavens and tread upon the heads of the aristocracy. No few of the onlookers brimmed with secret delight, practically on the verge of clapping and cheering at Lu Jianxing's error. For without this defeat, how else could they have brought Goo Mahng and his slave army to heel? The timing couldn't have been more perfect. There will be no gravestones, no state funeral. Deputy General Lu Jianxing will be interrogated and executed at the end of autumn. General Goo will be stripped of his military rank. The remaining soldiers will be provisionally detained to prevent any violence. This was the emperor's final judgment and punishment. Battlefields were fickle things. There was no such thing as a god of war who could weather 100 battles unscathed. Mu Zhonglian, Yue Chengqing, and Moxi could afford to lose battles because they stood shoulder to shoulder with imperial power. The same noble blood ran in their veins. It was only Goo Mahng who couldn't. He needed to fail but once for these powerful officials to come swarming, trampling over him so he could never rise again, nor lift his head. So the emperor's refusal was quite correct. The callous voice that floated down from the imperial throne became the final straw that broke Goo Mahng. It is at our mercy that you can keep your life. You are standing here today because of the late emperor's divine grace. Do you think your life is worth the cost of a formal burial for these defeated troops? You have no right to discuss it with me. Thus was Goo Mahng's last attempt and only plea mercilessly dismissed by the emperor before the watching court. He couldn't honor his promise in the end. The dead were denied grave inscriptions. The living were taken into custody, and Goo Mahn's brother-in-arms had his head lopped off and his corpse displayed at the Eastern market for 3 days and nights. He lost everything in the blink of an eye. Morsi had been far from the imperial capital during all of this. By the time he held up the history mirror and saw what happened, by the time he saw Goo Mahng slamming his head into the ground until it was bloody, sobbing as he knelt and cowered, plummeting from hope to despair, from impassioned pleading to despondent silence, by the time he saw all of this, Goo Mahng had already left the capital. Everything was already over. Perhaps his obsession ran too deep. Morsi dreamed of this sight for years. He dreamed of Goo Mahng howling in grief, smashing his head against the floor in heartbreak. The palace hall filled with mocking faces of court officials, and the emperor handing down his verdict without mercy. In Morsi's dreams, he would often be in the hall too, perhaps because he'd always thought that everything might have gone differently had he been there. Or perhaps none of this would have happened if, after Morsi returned to the capital, he had noticed Goo Mahn's growing desire to defect. What a fool he'd been. He had seen clearly Goo Mahng's deterioration and heartbreak when he returned from the front lines. But Goo Mahng then had seemed so listless, like he might spend the rest of his life in a morose stupor. Morsi had feared that Goo Mahng wouldn't be able to get back on his feet, but he'd never thought that Goo Mahng would defect. He'd never imagined that Goo Mahng could defect. Goo Mahng had always been like a god to him. Morsi had been so young then. How could he know that even gods could crumble and collapse? He had thought Goo Mahng invincible. When he considered that righteous, enthusiastic, smiling Shuxiong, the Shuxiong whom nothing could break, the General Goo who could endure any misery, Morsi simply couldn't believe that Goo Mahn's heart had died in that throne room, that it had shattered into fragments and been crushed to dust, never to be put whole again. Actually, I couldn't argue when you left and defected, said Morsi. But out of all the 9 provinces and 28 nations, why did you have to choose the darkest one? Goo Mahng didn't immediately respond. After a lengthy pause, he said, I don't know. He was struggling to relate to his former self in the story Morsi had told. His mind was in a mess. He could perhaps understand the despair he felt and the motives he had, but it was just as Morsi said. He couldn't understand why he'd gone to Liao. What could he do in the Liao kingdom? Forced to guess, he could only believe it was for revenge. The Liao kingdom alone could give him the requital he wanted. If he made a name for himself in the Liao kingdom, he could avenge himself upon the emperor who had humiliated him, had disdained him. But if that were the truth, he would really be, as Morsi said, a person fighting only for his own ideals and vengeance, regardless of how much blood he shed. Goo Mahng buried his face in his palms, then clutched at his hair in confusion. I don't know, he mumbled. I can't think of another reason either. Neither can I. Goo Mahng, you had your code of brotherhood and your unbreakable promise, and I have mine, Morsi said. Since you chose revenge, then you and I, you and Chonghua, are destined for this sort of end. Goo Mahng sat disconsolately on his little stool without a word. He vacantly stared at the brick flooring in front of him through his fingers. At last, Morsi stood up. You should take 2 more doses of calming medicine today. His Imperial Majesty wouldn't want you to remember too many details about your defection. If you want to live a little longer, don't think about these things again. Whew. Okay, so today is going to be a short one because my voice is a little hoarse. I guess I've done a lot of talking this weekend, from doing the live recap of Volume 2 and then a live reading with you guys on Patreon. And then I went to a family fun fest at my husband's church, and I'm not really a yeller or anything, but I was getting woo hype and stuff. And so, and then reading again this morning. I think my throat is like, hey, take a break. So I'm going to drink some tea and stuff and whatnot. But anyway, let's go ahead and just talk about this, shall we? Because, wow. As I said, of course, Goo Mahng was definitely going to be getting more memories in this book. And unfortunately, it's not, well, it's been not useful stuff, but he's also been getting more history, not necessarily memories, but history, which has been more heavy stuff. So first, I want to start with Goo Mahng feeling that this forbidden area of the Warrior Soul Mountain being familiar to him. And, Morsi is like, no, that area is forbidden, so there's no way. I don't know about that. I feel like if he feels it's familiar, then he must have been there. So now our question is, why was he there and what was he doing there? But also, why is it forbidden and what is in that area? Guess we'll find that out at some point. Probably not in this book. I just feel like it won't be in this book. So then we have, so Morsi went ahead and told the Imperial Majesty that Goo Mahng wanted to make amends and start over. And oddly enough, what does the Emperor do? He gives Morsi the book, Introduction to Magic and History of Chonghua, so that Goo Mahng can learn magic and, well, learn the history. Which at first I was like, okay, what are you up to, Emperor? But very quickly, of course, it's because he's giving Goo Mahng the opportunity to learn, to hopefully remember more things, to use him, essentially, and I just think it's interesting again that, Goo Mahng was like, oh, did the Emperor agree to let me learn, to start over? And Morsi was like, no, the end is still the same, my guy. And yet Goo Mahng's stance was still the same. He was like, okay, well, I mean, if he wants to use me, I guess that's good too. Things have to happen. And so one thing in particular that I wanted to talk about was when Morsi, after really explaining to him, like, there's really, really, truly no hope for you, even with this, even with knowing the Emperor wants to use you, okay, then don't be bitter about it in the end. And I appreciated Goo Mahng saying, oh, I'm gonna be bitter. I just thought it was funny, but it was so relatable. And I think it's also fair. Like, I don't know. I'm going to give you guys a personal example in a second, but just because someone knows the stakes of something doesn't mean that they don't have the right to still be human and feel what they feel. For example, when I was in conversation with, my mother, I was going, my siblings, I was about to say my students, but they ended up being my students. My siblings were homeschooled by her and by my stepfather. He sucked at it and she didn't suck at it, I suppose, but she didn't want to do it necessarily because she had her own endeavors. And so I, being someone who was getting my TEFL license and everything, was like, sure, I would love to teach them. I could be their homeschool teacher. And so in advance, she did inform me that my brother, my younger brother, I think at the time he was like 7, he had a lot of issues, not necessarily learning issues, even though that was a thing, but he had very bad attitude issues. Like his outbursts were so bad that it was concerning. I'm not even going to lie. If he was in a regular school, they probably would have investigated the home to see what was going on because his outbursts were that bad. And she warned me about this to let me know. And I was like, okay, well, I'll just see how things go, and go from there. And oh yeah, for 5 long months, I got to experience those outbursts. They were horrifyingly bad, but I persevered and I didn't complain. And it was just, it was something. But then finally one day he snapped so bad and I was just at the end of the rope. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. And I told her and I told her husband, I was like, if I want to keep the love that I have for my brother and I don't want to build any resentment for him, I can't teach him anymore. I was like, I can continue teaching my little sister, my baby sister, who was enthusiastic about learning, but I can't teach him. And both of them understood perfectly fine. But then some other things happened, and you guys already know. We ended up falling out, and I had multiple conversations with my mom. I'm sorry, they weren't really conversations. They were really more her talking at me, and then whenever I tried to speak, she would just interrupt me. But one of the things that she told me, she was like, well, I told you from the beginning how your brother was, so you don't have the right to complain about blah, 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 snore. And I just thought, that's weird logic. That's like telling someone, even if you know that sometimes your job is going to be hard, you absolutely have no right to complain about it whatsoever. And that kind of takes away from a person's humanity or just the right. Like, it doesn't, like, I know sometimes marriage is going to be hard. Are you telling me that I can never complain, even though going into this, I knew that it wouldn't be all sunshine and roses? And so just thinking about this particular instance, it's like, no. Goo Mahng has 100% right to be bitter, even with him knowing the end result, even with him getting some of his memories back. And we know he's going to get even more back once he knows why he defected, what happened, all of that stuff. He has full right to be bitter because he was treated so poorly. And we still don't know the reasons behind his defection. But he has the right to feel his emotions because he still experienced what he experienced. He still went through that pain and everything. And so I'm just glad that he was like, oh no, there will be bitterness. I was like, yes, sir, you tell it. Just because you know something doesn't mean that you don't have feelings toward it. So anyway, so my next note, I guess now we know. I had said in the last book or whatever, I wasn't sure if Jiang Fuli's medicine was working or if it wasn't, or if it was and Goo Mahng was still getting some of the heavier memories just because, something may have triggered it, but that, maybe there are deeper memories it was burying. And we did get that information. So it is working. Even if Goo Mahng does get some sad memories or something, it's still for now burying the deeper memories. And it's possibly like calming him down so that he's not, going too deep into despair and listlessness or anything like he has been these past couple days, just kind of sad and pensive and everything. Let's see. As far as this history that we got, Tang, the headmaster of a cultivation academy and even a state preceptor, him having this like golden hands and having such great talent and teaching people, and then having this slave, which he eventually named Poe-ahn, all of that. I'm not going to, just like go over it again. But it seems that in this book, Meat Bun just wants to have a constant theme of betrayal, but also slave betrayal. Well, only 2 slave betrayals, but, Morsi's uncle also betrayed. He just wasn't a slave. But that seems to be the theme that she wants to have in this. Okay. And I'm just kind of like, can we stop with the betrayal? Nevertheless, it's very crazy to hear this story of Poe-ahn and Tang. Oh my God, my throat. So him being the founder of the Liao Kingdom is just, okay. I don't know what to say to that. That's just very, very disgusting. But one thing I can't, so he's just crazy. But one thing that I can say is, as far as these nobles being leery of allowing slaves to cultivate and have any form of power, it's like you wouldn't have anything to fear if you treated them like people in the first place. The problem is not slaves getting power and then defecting or revolting or anything like that. The problem is slaves being slaves. Like thinking about American history, if Black people had enough gusto to just do what Poe-ahn did, and revolt, things would have been justified if that's what they wanted to do. Because how were they treated? They were treated so awfully. But did it ever occur to you that if you never treated them, these slaves, so horribly, if they were allowed to just be people, they could have been lower class people, you know, because money and status and stuff, whatever. But if they were just treated like normal people, maybe the thought, the desire to revolt would never have been a thing in the first place. And so it's like, yeah, I understand why you're leery, but that's because of your own bad actions towards slaves. So, you know, it just is what it is. And even when it comes to Goo Mahng, who is not like Poe-ahn at all, he wouldn't have defected. It's like y'all are doing things that are making these slaves want to defect. Goo Mahng was even willing to die for what had happened in that battle. He was like, just take my life, okay? Take mine and we'll be fine. But not only did the emperor not take his life, he spat on his life by basically saying, you are unworthy. Like, what, you think your death is enough? And all of your soldiers are unworthy. They don't deserve a name. So to say something like that, what other reaction did you expect? So that's all I have to say on that. I feel like my thoughts are kind of all jumbled, but if you're sticking with me throughout this part today, good, cool. So anyway, we finally learned what actually happened with Lu Jianxing and his hot-temperedness and all of that. I guess there's really nothing to say. I get Goo Mahng wanting to take responsibility for that. And I do think that it's partially his responsibility. But at the same time, Lu Jianxing was a grown-ass man. And he made that decision to do what he did. So it was still his fault in the end. And yeah, he needed to be beheaded. So anyway, I don't really have anything else to say. We're just going to see what happens in the next chapters. I hope you all have a good day. And I'm going to go rest. Yeah. Well, Einiman.